Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our first webinar of the RES4Africa Foundation. As you know, we work since 2012 to promote the deployment of energy transition in African countries, meeting the local energy needs for growth. Well, the COVID has been described as the biggest global economic shock in peacetime since 1930s, and that sure had a severe impact on employment and investment also in Africa across all sectors. Therefore, governments are responding to propose you three of our flagship studies. The first one today is on the impact of COVID, and the report written by us together with the UNECA and Bocconi will be available to all of you soon. But each webinar will have deliverables. We not only love to have you there, but we will reward you with some piece of information which hopefully is going to be original and helpful. Today we present our first webinar in this work, and first of all I want to thank all the speakers, particularly keynote speaker Kamisekera Daipra from Enel, Maximilian Jarrett from IEA, William Lugembwa from UNECA, and Rabia Ferruti from will guide us and in the day, and I will resume the meeting at the end. So have a great day. Thank you, Joy, for taking the floor, and thanks to all of you. Joy, wait.
We cannot hear you.
Great. Warm welcome to each and every one of you, and greetings to each and every one of you from wherever it is you're joining us, in whatever time zone you're in across the world. It's good to have you on this year's virtual webinars organized by RES4Africa, or Renewable Energy Solutions for Africa Foundation. And we are going to be having 3 virtual webinars, this being the very first one, and the next one will be taking place on the 8th of July, and the last one and final one will be taking place on the 15th of July 2020. So today we are focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on Africa's energy sector and the role of renewables in empowering a long-term and sustainable recovery for the continent. As we all know, about 600 million Africans live in abject poverty with little or no access to energy and water. And now that we are in a crisis, imagine how these 600 million people could be living without any access to energy or water. And those are the kind of conversations we're going to be having today. So I'd like to take us through a quick roundup of how we're going to be having our speakers have this discussion. We're going to have a discussion on renewables as a driver for a green recovery, which is going to be a presentation by Mr. Antonio Kamisekera, who is the president of RES4Africa Foundation and the CEO of Enel Green Power. And later we'll be having Lamberto Daipra, who is the head of Africa, Asia and Oceania area for the Enel Green Power. And he will be talking about the role of the private sector in sustaining Africa's economic recovery. And then later we will be having Maximilian Jarrett, I hope I got that name right, who'll be talking about how energy systems responded to the global crisis. And much later, we'll have William Lugemwa, who is the Director of the Private Sector Development and Finance Division at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, who will talk about Africa and COVID-19 and the international cooperation and the role of strategic infrastructures. And then we'll be having a presentation as well by Rabia Faruqi, who is the Director, Knowledge, Policy and Finance Center at the International Renewable Energy Agency, Irena. We'll talk about renewable energy as a key enabler for a green, sustainable recovery for Africa. Then we will have report presentations as well, which I'm sure are going to be shared with you along the way, so you can be able to read through as well. So to start this off, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite our very first speaker, who is none other than Antonio Kamisekra, the President of RES4Africa and the CEO of NL Green Power. You can clap your hands if you want.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I think you cannot see me though, right?
You
cannot see me because the Secretary General of the association is so bad with me that he didn't let any space available for me, but that's okay. You know my face. We are exiting in Italy and in most of Europe from a very severe and unforgettable experience. And unfortunately, most of the world is still in the middle of it. The worst of the pandemic is not over yet in many countries. We are now somewhat in Europe, especially in Southern Europe, leaving the so-called third phase, in which we are now counting, first of all, the death. That's a very sad story. But we're counting let's say the million or billions of euros that we have wasted because of the severe, dramatically severe measures we had to take in the aim to control and limit the pandemic. And now we are working with some enthusiasm, I would say, in order to do two things. One is to offer the investments that were already scheduled and desired from a political point of view in the renewable industry as the pillar of the energy transition in Europe, as we're offering those investments as one of the most impactful stimulus for the recovery. And the reason why we're doing it is twofold. And that's why I said we are doing two things. Because from one side, there are very few industrial sectors that can activate massive billionaire or even trillionaire level of investments in short time like renewables can do. And the reason why is because you know very well, it's a very fragmented market. So the trillions of euros of investments would be some of thousands and thousands of projects in the hands of hundreds and hundreds of investors. And the other reason why we are offering it is because there is a risk of tracing back on the gains, on the conquests of the towards sustainability that we made all around the world, convincing with two basically weapons, two levers, the economicity, so the competitiveness, and the sustainability, that the only way to generate electricity going forward should be through renewables. And in a period of crisis like this, and unprecedented, at least in our age, we have, at least in Europe, the luxury of having had 70 years, 75 years of peace, never experienced before in the history of Europe. So we don't have in our memory, in our fresh memory of living people, the consequences of a war. So we are testing something that was completely new for many generations, okay, and was produced only in 2-3 months. So the risk of considering sustainability and the energy transition something secondary to the urgent need to go back and recover, whatever it takes, was absolutely on the table. Luckily, we have the beauty, we have the let's say the fortunate case of having a absolutely God blessed, I would say, leadership in Europe in this moment that is absolutely taking this issue off the table. There can only be one recovery way, and the recovery is through renewables. Why I'm saying this in a seminar dedicated to Africa? Because there is no difference. Absolutely, actually, these concepts are 10 times, 100 times more important and valid when we cast into the Africa economy. The consequences of the COVID may be more severe, less severe, in a longer time, in a shorter time, we don't know in Africa. But you can bet that when this will be over, I hope very soon, after the severe lockdowns, the health and measures that the several nations in Africa will take, the governments of Africa will decide, there will be a background noise. Now we have to go back and recover, and many things that have been not conquered yet in the public agenda of Africa could be put on a second level of priority, which would be a dramatic mistake for the same reasons. What you can quickly activate as investments. So I would not want to waste your time by repeating that Africa needs energy, that there are 600 million people, because we all know this. The reason why we do exist, the reason why we have RES4Africa is exactly for this. So the new things is COVID. That's why I'm focusing on COVID, okay, on the recovery. So in a situation where only 2% of the global investments, renewables, were dedicated to Africa in the last 10 years, only 2%, and there were the largest number of people without access to a stable source of electricity and in general of energy, with the dramatic consequences of this also in the social and economical development of people, families, women in particular, in many countries of Africa. When we cast on top of it this dramatic, the dramatic consequences of pandemic, you will easily understand that we are creating the perfect storm. So my message is, there cannot be any other form of recovery than through renewables. So if we needed renewables as the source through which Africans will have access, not could, will have access to electricity, today in the new situation, this is 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, million times even more true. So we are all called to a collective effort to convince governments in Africa that if they do the right things, easing with their political power, with their, let's say, prerogatives in deciding and choosing, there will be billions and billions of euros, of dollars, of money available for investments in renewable projects that are just waiting for the right set of conditions to be put in place. There are examples in Africa already, successful examples. We all know Morocco, South Africa, and other countries. There are few countries that embraced with passion the route of renewables. But this is now extraordinarily more valid. And I want to use an economical reasonment. It's not because we have to go back to a more sustainable lifestyle. That's all true, you know, it's what we are saying since years. But it's because there is nothing fast like renewables that could represent an immediate investments in many with fragmented levels. So we don't need we don't need to build a highway from Cape Town to Cairo. We're talking of thousands and thousands of relatively small investments that can be activated basically everywhere around Africa, creating jobs, creating opportunities, creating positive spillover effects at all possible levels. So if it was true yesterday, it's extraordinary true, and actually not even true, it's absolutely mandatory today. We have Africa have the example of the discussion going on in Europe, for example, where the green recovery put at the center the energy transition. So we had the vision of becoming Europe, becoming the cleanest economy in the world. We got the pandemic, disaster, and then now again, there cannot be another recovery other than a green one. So I think we have to monitor very closely if there can be the attempt to survive of declining technology, dying sectors that could find in the pandemic the last opportunity to maybe survive for a couple of years more, or even more. That would be a dramatic mistake for the African countries. We exit from the pandemic only being more convinced that sustainability is the only way to live our future lives. And when it's about energy, renewables is the only way to generate sufficiently in an economy, safety, reliability, and in an equitative way, electricity for the African populations. So that's all I want, just to kickstart and ignite the discussion. And I hope we can have a fruitful discussion in this webinar. It's the first of a series. I'm very happy that we are not stopping our interaction even during, let's say, the severe moment that we are living from our homes. But that's actually something positive. We're learning a lot of how to interact in a digital way, avoiding to move people all around. It's of course very pleasant to meet you in person everywhere. But of course, we will not stop discussing and, let's say, working hard to make our view of a renewable Africa come true, because we cannot physically meet and shake hands. We can do it in an electronic, virtual way, which is less fun, but equally effective. So enjoy the webinar, be alive, interrupt, and do it in a joyful way, because we need to work very hard, even more now that we have got this difficult 2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Antonio Kamisekera. That was quite an interesting conversation you just shared right there. Round of applause. I'm doing this virtually now. I hope you were able to see that, or at least hear it. One thing or one message that I have picked out of his message is that there can't be any other recovery other than a green one. And if really there's any message that our African leaders can take out of this, it has to be that. If we get out of this crisis and we haven't made decisions or created policies that are renewable, I think we will be making a dramatic mistake, just like Mr. Kamisekera put it. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be Lamberto Daiproa, who is the head of Africa, Asia, and I beg your pardon, Lamberto Daiproa, who is the head of Africa, Asia, and Oceania area at the NL Green Power, to talk to us about the role of the private sector in sustaining Africa's economic recovery. And I would like to thank all 304 of you for making time to take part in this conversation. A round of applause for Lamberto. Let me see if I have my virtual hand clap.
Good day to everybody. Apparently I have some troubles with the camera as well. No problem for that. let me start just saying that of course the pandemic put a huge and considerable strain on investments, and especially on the logistical side, and blocking the job site works, and of course hindering operations. Not to mention, of course, the supply chains disruption. As operators, we went on where possible with our activities. For instance, our job sites have been stopped in South Africa due to the total lockdown regulations, but went on, although hindered in other places, for instance, Morocco, where the lockdown provisions were less strict. Before the pandemic crisis, the renewable new installed installations were expected to reach a new world record in 2020. There's no doubt that the world is going to build a lower amount of renewable capacity this year. However, the renewable investments are expected to recover in 2021, next year. So it's a difficult and uncertain moment. But I mean, through this hard time, we discovered as well our resilience. As Antonello mentioned, we are deeply convinced that promoting the renewable sector is and will be the key to restart the economy and to restart, let's say, the ensuing jobs creation. The key point for operators is, of course, to go on with their investments and, of course, possibly starting new ones. So we must go back to the usual dilemma, which is what is needed to attract investments in a country, which is, of course, enabling, making available an enabling environment. And the only way to create this environment is, of course, through appropriate regulatory frameworks and risk mitigation measures. In Africa, where the power sector is already vulnerable and unstable, I mean, this crisis is highlighting once more the urgent need of policies and actions to increase the access to energy. We of course must take advantage of this period to plan, to think better about the measures to foster investments and of course to push the economy restart. So leaders and policymakers have a great opportunity to coordinate in this period. Also because such investments put into the renewable field may provide access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy for all the continent. Another key point is there's no need to create new rules or laws, but just to put in practice and in the proper way the lessons we learned so far. There are cases in the African continent of great success. I mean, there are countries that have done a lot in this field. Morocco, Egypt, of course, South Africa, and other Zambia joined in the later stage. Now these countries can boast having an important renewable portion of their generation portfolio. And the reason why they have had such investments is because they adopted a proper regulatory frameworks and promoting transparent rules and transparent tendering procedures. But this is of course not enough. I mean, despite, you know, there's been many programs aimed at promoting the growth and the integration of renewables, but I mean, the efforts were a bit dispersive and did not quite create the wished results at continental level. So there's no doubt we need to step it up. And for instance, I would mention the Renew Africa initiative, which is something that is, I mean, already know we are promoting, that could manage to do this. This initiative, Renew Africa, is combining the efforts of the industry. There are more than 25, I mean, European players and financial and political institutions, and of course other involved stakeholders. And the scope of this is, of course, to create appropriate environment for the investments in the renewable energy sector. What is dealt by Renew Africa are, of course, the usual points that must be still solved. For instance, extend to a wider number of African countries the policies that have been successfully adopted by some of them. I've been mentioning 4 or 5 nations, but there are 54 of them in the continent, to use multiple renewable technologies. Today, we have confined to wind and solar, but there are also geothermal and hydro that can be, let's say, adopted in many places of the continent. Of course, most important, considering investments, is to adoption of risk mitigation actions. And last but not least, although we are speaking of renewables, but a very important thing to be done is to improve the grids. So to improve the transmission, the distribution of the electricity at several levels. And this is one of the greatest issues the African continent is facing today. Another key point, renewables do not require government funding. The money comes from the investors, the money comes from the banks. And therefore, if certain models are put in place, as they have been put in place in the countries I've been mentioning, the governments will be allowed to allocate their budgets in dealing with the impact of the coronavirus instead of putting them in investments that, will be done by other operators. Of course, this is not easy. It requires a high-level dialogue because, again, a solid regulatory framework must be put in place. Instruments of mixed financing and risk mitigation must be put in place. This in order to facilitate the funding. And last but not least, a very important thing, which is the capacity building and the knowledge transfer to support, projects on the long term. So, let's conclude by saying that we could take advantage of this very tough period as an important opportunity to plan again and again the measure that could really foster the investments and allow a full recovery of the economy and the growth that is going to come. Thank you.
Appreciate. Thank you very much. And well, the key point I'm picking out of this, which I would like also to share amongst us, is that renewable energy doesn't require government funding. It really comes from investors and banks. And that in a way could help African countries as well decide how important, how best to prioritize renewable energy in the different parts of Africa, especially those that do not have any access at all to energy. And well, our next speaker is Maximilian Jarrett, who is the Africa Program Manager, International Energy Agency, IEA, and he's going to share on how energy systems responded to the global crisis.
Good morning, and thank you for your time. I hope the colleagues on that side have put my slides up. Thank you very much. So I'm representing my colleagues who put this together. It's IEA perspective on how the energy systems have responded to the global COVID-19 crisis. So the first thing we can say is that COVID has been a historic, next slide, please. It's a once in a century event for the energy and electricity demand. That is something that we know quite clearly. And the global picture is truly remarkable. We assume a gradual recovery over several months, but annual energy demand for 2020 is going to be by at least 6%, wiping off the last 5 years of demand growth. Next slide, please. Could you please, thank you. Like CO2 emissions are dropping the most ever, of course, because a lot of the confinement measures and so forth are having that effect. And we estimate that global energy-related CO2 emissions are set to fall nearly 8% in 2020 to the lowest level in the decade. Reduced coal use is being overtaken by low carbon electricity sources, and that contributes to most of the decline in CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. I'm going to go quickly through the kind of perspective and then focus in on what we are saying should be done. So in Africa, we see very much that our energy systems are under increasing pressure on the continent. Energy demand, for example, in Africa, from a 2.5 annual growth between 2010 and 2018, is estimated to drop this year, 2020, by more than 2%. Next slide, please. Many countries are now, of course, taking policy action to try and deal with this, but what's also really causing great concern is the drop in investment. Investment has been hit by lockdowns and by demand and by revenue uncertainties. You can see from the slide there the global end user energy spending, and you can see the change in estimated 2020 investment versus 2019 by sector. 32% oil and gas, 15% coal, 10% power, and 12% energy use and efficiency. Next slide, please. Now we know that investment in power is faltering, but it's going the opposite direction to where we need it to go. It really needs to be ramped up. We know that especially in Africa, there's a need to not just keep the pace, but step up the pace. And that's something that the global community and of course African governments and so forth have to pay particular attention to make sure that we get this investment in power, keep it, and we boost it. Next slide, please. Now we see that if we look particularly in Africa, there's been a sharp decline in energy investment. You see that 2015 was remarkably high, but since 2015, the year of the Paris Agreement, energy investment in Africa actually has been lower. Next slide, please. Now, in response to this historic situation, the IEA has recently worked on a special report, a special World Energy Outlook report, which just was launched last week, and that presents a plan for sustainable recovery post-COVID-19. And the three elements of that are boost the economy, create jobs, and improve energy resilience and sustainability. Next slide, please. The plan for that is that to have, well, the plan shows select measures relevant to Africa, you know, that those can include the expansion of our LPG, deployment of mini grids, and deployment, for example, of efficient agricultural irrigation pumps. 1 trillion for 3 years, and electricity we get about 33% of that, efficiency 40%, and others 27%. So there we have it. That is what we have on the table from IEA. I urge you all to go to our website, download the report. I mean, it's a very dense report. I went very quickly through it, just to kind of give you a picture of the context in which we're living right now, and take on board the insights provided by IEA and some of the recommendations that we're making that can help the globe and Africa to move forward fast from this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I do note the expansion of LPG, deployment of mini grids, deployment of efficient agricultural irrigation pumps, and all of these, of course, are mainly powered by RE or renewable energy. Now, from that, of course, and how our energy systems responded to the global crisis, you do realize that Maximilian mentioned that Africa's investment in RE has dropped since the crisis. And that is a very scary place to be, knowing that now more than ever is when we should be investing in renewable energy, because globally, investment in renewable energy is set to go up by about $400 billion globally. So our next speaker is going to talk about Africa and COVID-19 and, of course, the international cooperation and the role of strategic infrastructures. William Lugemwa is the Director of the Private Sector Development and Finance Division at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA. William, it's good to have you. William, can you hear me? I think your microphone is mute. You need to activate your microphone or unmute it.
Good morning, everybody. And is it okay now?
Yes, it's perfect. Go ahead.
Good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to all the participants. And thank you for the organizers. My name is William Lugemwa from the UN Economic Commission for Africa. I'm going to be briefly talking about the impact of COVID-19 on Africa's energy sector, the role of renewables to empower a long-term sustainability and recovery of the African economies. COVID-19 pandemic has triggered demand and supply side shocks to the African economies. The risk of the economic impacts in Africa is that the progress made recently in tackling extreme poverty may be reversed. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa projects that 5 million to 29 million people, depending on the severity of COVID-19 and the duration of the measures being taken, could fall back to extreme poverty for at least, in some instances, up to 10 years. A decline in economic growth is also expected to disrupt the labor market. The International Labour Organization projects that Africa may face up to 19 million job losses. Africa also faces public finance challenges related to revenue collection and rising expenditure in health and social protection. In an environment where tax to GDP ratio was already low at approximately 13.4% before the COVID pandemic. The depreciation of national currencies, particularly in oil exporting countries, has added further macroeconomic strain requiring stabilization funds. Based on these projections and impacts, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa advocates for up to $100 billion in funding for African health and social safety net fund, and other economic support funds are needed in this regard. In the oil and gas sector, COVID has had a huge impact on global commodity markets. Oil prices have plunged in the first quarter of this year, with oil prices staying below and now in the range of around $30 per barrel. The plunge is having negative effects in oil exporting African countries, including huge budget deficits. For budget planning, most countries had budgeted a price of over $85 per barrel, and others had also budgeted between $55 and $70 per barrel. The unanticipated plunge in oil prices below the budgeted price target is expected to introduce huge fiscal distress in African economies. In the electricity sector, we face major disruptions due to COVID-19, with a decline in industrial and commercial activities and resultant decline in demand for electricity in most countries in Africa. Few countries in Africa could have benefited from the low prices that have been in the market in the last 6 months or so. A number of African countries that generate the electricity from thermal sources, for example, Eritrea, Senegal, Niger, Benin, and Sudan. In these countries, there's a major opportunity in reinvesting the savings from lower oil prices towards sustainable energy resources. There's a need to focus on energy sector as we plan to rebuild back better. We've done analysis, and it is well known within the industry that a 1% increase in GDP growth will increase electricity demand in industry by more than 1%. Renewables have the potential to create up to 42 million jobs, expand employment in energy efficiency to 21 million. Infrastructure investments up, and we all know that infrastructure investments are proven recession and bounce back sources due to their labor-intensive nature. Energy infrastructure investments will provide significant opportunities to build back better and develop a low carbon economy and climate smart economy in Africa. Clean energy to meet our current and future development challenges in Africa. Hence the UNECA emphasis on investments in the clean energy in Africa. However, there are a number of challenges that need to be addressed to manage the impact of COVID-19 in the electricity sector on the continent. Increased household demand for electricity has got challenges of inability to pay. A number of African households may not be able to pay for this electricity, and hence the need for investments in clean energy. And as we've seen in the markets recently, the leveraged cost of electricity from solar and renewable energy is coming down. We also face uncertainty in terms of financing and the cost of debt among the contracting parties. Most of the African utilities are already experiencing financial strain and may struggle to provide services. Liquidity challenges to finance new energy projects due to priorities in health and social projection due to COVID-19. As you're aware, with the impact of COVID-19, the main focus has been on health and social intervention, and hence priorities towards energy may not be top of the agenda in most countries at this point in time. Finally, COVID has caused painful economic impacts in Africa, and this is across all sectors. The energy sector has faced major challenges as we've outlined above. A resilient and sustainable recovery from COVID will therefore require solutions including a greater participation of the private sector and improved international development cooperation. As highlighted by my previous colleagues, investments in renewables is driven mostly by the private sector. And hence, we foresee that post-COVID, the private sector is going to be very instrumental, especially in the provision of electricity. We know already from the analysis from UNECA and other agencies that, that recovery in the African economies will be very difficult without further investment in infrastructure. Infrastructure is needed, energy is needed, and hence our support for further investments in renewable energies. Thank you so much. I'll stop here for now. My colleague will give further details as to what we're doing within the renewable sector. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, William. And speaking of the study that has been developed by RES4Africa Foundation and UNECA in partnership with SDA Bocconi and with the support of Southern African Power Pool and the Ethiopian Women in Energy, aims to explore the impact of COVID-19 on the African economies and the energy sector. So I guess it's going to give us like a whole 360 view of what exactly needs to be done post-COVID, and probably starting now, going forward on how renewable energies can be prioritized for the African continent as well. And William did mention the fact that now, during the crisis, we are seeing an increased household usability, but then again, inability to pay for this electricity, which means we're going to have to invest more in clean energy solutions. So our next speaker is Rabia Faruqi, who is the Director, Knowledge, Policy and Finance Center at the International Renewable Energy Agency, Irena, and she's going to talk to us about renewable energy as a key enabler for a green, sustainable recovery of Africa. Welcome, Rabia.
Thank you very much, moderator. Thank you, Roberto, for the invitation. Always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you also for providing Irena with the opportunity to give some insights to regional results that we have. I'll not go through the indicators, so you can pass the slide number 1. But I would like to just say that over the past couple of months, we have been focusing on ways to use the energy sector as a lever for wider transformative recovery, showing the investment needs and providing evidence for job and GDP benefits from this energy transition, and recommending also policy measures for the energy transition, both in the short term because of this crisis and in the medium terms. So the recommendation that we give in the short term for this ambitious transition pathway, we are trying to outline the recommendation in a way to align the short-term economic downturn with the medium and long-term needs for a sustainable path or an ambitious energy transition. I cannot tell you much about the report because it will be launched in 2 hours by our Director General, but I invite you to go to the Financial Times webinar to listen to it. But I will still give you some contours of what we mean. So to meet you can go to next slide, please. To meet the needs of the growing population and the energy needs, the Irena transforming scenario, the ambitious scenario that we have been looking at for 2030 and 2050, estimates obviously that renewable energy is key. It can cover 40% of sub-Saharan Africa needs from domestic and clean renewable energy by 2030. We estimate the modern renewables could amount to about 190 gigawatts in 2030, covering basically half of the continent's total power generation capacity. This is a 6-fold increase from 33 or so gigawatts currently. Also, energy efficiency is very important, and use of modern appliances, which will decrease energy intensity quite significantly. What does it mean in terms of investment? We need about, according to our estimate, we need $95 billion per year between now and 2030. This seems like a huge amount, but this will generate substantial savings because we estimate that $1 spent would generate about a $3 to $8 return. This will not only help cushion the negative economic impact we're seeing now with COVID-19, which is the immediate challenge, but also meet the medium and long-term recovery goal. So from this investment, very briefly, about a third would go to renewables. That would be mainly, from the renewables investments, a third would go to PV, utility and rooftop. This would follow by hydro and wind with about each 20%, and then biomass and CSP each 20%. Next slide, please. So what does it mean in terms of benefits? We have an ambitious energy pathway, but what does it result in? Well, it results in a boost in GDP compared to the planned scenario by an average of 0.6% per year. It might not mean much, 0.6%, but this is a boost over GDP that would happen from the planned scenario. And in cumulative terms, this would mean about $168 billion between now and 2030. I'm not going much into this, just to tell you that our welfare indicators, all of this is based on the macroeconometric model, shows that the welfare gain, so it's not just GDP, but if you account with the welfare index, that the well-being will improve by over 30%. Next slide, please. If you look at just renewable energy jobs, next slide, please. So if you look just at renewable jobs from this transition and these investments that I'm talking about, then you will see that jobs in sub-Saharan Africa by 2030 we could be boosted by 900,000 jobs, which is quite a bit in the energy sector. We are currently just 40 million globally. So this would be about half of it, 500,000 in renewable energy jobs from this transition, and 400,000 from energy efficiency. There will be job losses from the decrease in fossil fuel investments, but this will be outweighed by the creation of jobs in transition-related technologies, efficiency, renewables, and grid and flexibility. Next one, please. So these were the renewable energy jobs. Can we go to next one, please? Yeah, no. So Maybe I can continue, maybe the slides don't work, but there's a next slide on medium-term policy measures. No, these were the renewable energy jobs. If you can just go to the next, please. So basically, this ambition pathway shows that, as was said with our first speaker, at the heart of this energy transition, the recovery, renewable energy are at the heart of this recovery. And I really like the fact that he said that if it's true, it's true today, it's certainly mandatory in the past, it's mandatory now. So what does it mean? It means that the crisis has unveiled major structural weaknesses of our socioeconomic system, and we need to seize the opportunity to embrace a more holistic framework. What does it mean very briefly? I won't go into much detail for the medium term, but we do have, as was said by many speakers before, an enabling framework to scale up to the transition with renewables at its center and introduce the policy measures that can facilitate investments, and we all know what they are. But beyond that, it is essential to introduce industrial policy that build and leverage domestic economic capacity. This means diversifying and deepening the supply chains and build industrial capacity in the energy sector and beyond. And we saw what the crisis gave in terms of major disruption in supply chains. Second, the industrial development goes hand in hand with effective education and labor market policies. The interventions are needed to support capacity building, to create those jobs that I was talking about, and ultimately foster a just transition. And this is true both in access and non-access. In the access context, we know that there needs an enabling environment, and importantly, we must integrate livelihood perspectives in the early stages of formulating and designing off-grid renewable energy solutions. So the traditional approaches to energy access involving distributed renewable energy have focused really on a certain number of connections or deploying a given number of systems. We need to encourage now productive end users and link them with livelihood, because until now it's like an afterthought. My last slide, and I'm sorry if I'm long. If we look at the immediate efforts that are needed in sub-Saharan Africa, given the crisis, we must focus, one, on the needs of the last mile enterprises and remote, and as well as the remote and vulnerable population that have very limited livelihood options. And in this context, you have in the slide a few of the measures, but you support. It's really essential right now that the packages, recovery packages, have support to utilities and distributed energy enterprises with relief measures, and there are many deferred and restructured payment, etc. Also look at the needs of the on the demand side, at the needs of livelihoods. I'm going to just finish maybe by saying that this crisis really provides government and investors with a historic opportunity to accelerate the energy transition. Irena has provided many a pathway to that ambitious pathway, including granular focus on regions, including Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And I think now more than ever, we need to place energy transition solution at the center, and to help to design these government decisions. The report that I'm told you that we're launching today provides short-term, within 3 years, and longer-term, within 10 years to 2030, measures that are essential to continue on the right pathway towards a transformative, let's say, the decarbonization of society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabia. That was quite insightful as well, talking about how RE can boost GDP, and of course, the number of jobs that could be created by the year 2030. That's quite impressive. 900,000 jobs, 500,000 or 500,000 of them in renewable energy sector, and 400,000 in energy efficiency. That is quite impressive. And maybe now is a good time for our governments as well to actualize some of these suggestions that are being put forward. And I like the fact that Rabia spoke about the focus on remote and the vulnerable population as well, and the opportunity to accelerate renewable energy solution transitions, now that we are taking this opportunity as well to right the wrongs from pre-COVID-19 and move towards a cleaner post-COVID-19. Now, I'd like for us to take some time, get to hear from the experts in the various fields. Johannes Halu is the Energy Economist Officer at UNECA, or United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. He's going to share about the macroeconomic effects of COVID-19 in Africa. So let's hear from him. Johannes, you can have your 10 minutes now. Or do I say 8?
It is, I'll try to make it as an 8.
Okay.
Good morning.
I think you're mute. We can't hear you. Johannes, please unmute your microphone.
Okay, I don't control the mic, so I'm waiting to be unmuted. And can I have the slides projected, please? Okay, fantastic. So thank you very much. I'll try to attempt to make it within 8 minutes, instructed by the moderator. Good morning to everyone, and good afternoon or good evening, wherever you're joining us to this very interesting panel. Just to start off, so far, what we have heard is we're dealing with unprecedented global crisis of the like of which we haven't seen in generations, with significant disruptions. We have also heard the central message of the importance of the private sector to come in and bridge in the necessary investments required, not only to recover from this, but to build back better. We have also heard arguments in terms of why clean energy has to be at the center of this recovery process and this recovery policy attention. My job here is basically to recast some of that argument and provide you some findings from the African side in terms of the economic implications of COVID so far. What are the kind of impacts we have seen, some of which have been discussed by Director William. I would like to emphasize on that. And then what some of the policy ideas that originated here in the continent in terms of macroeconomic recovery and where we go from here. I don't think I have control of the slides, but next slide, please. Okay. So I've already identified where I will take this discussion. I would start with basically giving you a glimpse, since we have been talking about COVID, where different regions in Africa are, very briefly, what kind of measures are being put in place by the countries and how stringent they are, and what are our vulnerabilities going forward in terms of dealing with this crisis. And then I would focus on the macroeconomic issues. This is important because economic response agenda in the continent so far has been motivated by, of course, macroeconomic policies. As you can imagine, this crisis has numerous effects on the energy sector, but other sectors as well. So what would be the proper role of energy within this broader context of economic stabilization and recovery provides us some context. And finally, I would reflect on some of the ideas that have already been shared in terms of how do we really build back, but build back better. It shouldn't be just recovery, but recovery that would also give us the platform towards meeting our sustainable development goals and other aspirations in the continent particularly. Next slide, please. So first, in terms of where we are on COVID and responses and vulnerabilities, let me take just a minute or so to take you through the different regions of Africa, so to have a visual image of what we're really talking about today. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. So this slide basically gives you an image of where Africa were last year. ECA, or the Economic Commission for Africa, traces economic and social development in the continent every year. In 2017, we grew at 3.4%, anticipating better growth in 2018. We grew at 3.2%. 2019, the continent grew at 3.4%. Back then, the projections of ECA and African Development Bank and other economic development institutions in the continent, the projection was we will grow between 3.2 to 3.9% this particular year. Of course, there was no insight about COVID. Of course, as we know, that projection in profile has completely turned around, and we'll see why. Let me take you through the different regions. Next slide, please. You're fine. This is a current, on the left panel is a progression of COVID in the continent. In North Africa, cases has been quite manageable until March, and then since April you can see rapid increases, particularly in Egypt and Algeria. And on the right, what you see is one, the stringency of protection measures put in place by different governments in the region. 100 means the most stringent measure you can take, and then close to 0 means almost no measure has been taken. So North African region has seen some of the most stringent response and restrictive measures to deal with the COVID crisis. On the right hand side, on a little bit on the right hand side of the panel, what you see is the risk factors. For example, the percent of population above 65 years is not that high in the region, and hospital beds per 100,000 population. Of course, the healthcare infrastructure is where most of the concern is coming from. In Central Africa, you see the same pattern. Since April, there has been a rapid increase in cases in Central Africa, and of course, a number of countries have taken a moderate to high stringent measure to deal with this particular crisis. Next slide. Next slide, please.
Right up. Right there.
So while that, yeah, here we go. In Eastern and Western Africa, as well as what you can see is starting April from low cases, by June we see rapid escalation. And of course, governments have intervened by putting in place very, very stringent measures in most cases, even though we have seen some lax measures in few countries. What is concerning here is, of course, the healthcare infrastructure, as you can see, is quite minimal. Therefore, the capacity to deal with this escalating crisis is a concern. Next slide. Okay, so finally in the Southern African region, fundamentally the same observation. So what is clear is continentally, we account only to 2.6% of global infections and 1.2% of the global death rate. But the question is, why are we too much worried about COVID if that is the statistics we have in front of us? The reason for that is, one, there are risk factors in the continent. One, we know about 600 million people in Africa live in urban areas, of which about 56% reside in highly congested urban environments. So the risk factor for further escalation is quite high. And of course, we have also about 1.8 hospital beds per 1,000 population, which means very limited healthcare infrastructure to deal with it. And then, of course, we have economic vulnerabilities, including our ability to increase public health spending and social protection spending in the midst of these restrictive measures put in place. And of course, some limited testing and other conditions. So some of the epidemiologic models are showing that the risk of escalation from here could be quite high. And then the likelihood of sustaining some of these measures can also be in place for some time. Next slide, please. So what all of this imply is that there are economic consequences coming from external and internal shocks. Next slide, please. Some of this have been discussed, so I'll take you quite briefly through some of the impacts that we have seen through our macroeconomic models at ECA. Next slide. So what, as William said, we're dealing with demand and supply side shocks. Supply side shock fundamentally because we have asked millions and millions of people just to stay at home, which impacted our industrial and service sectors. And demand side shock because we're not trading as much as before. Commodity prices have been affected. Investment, as we have heard, have been affected. And there has been severe consequences on government budget, revenue, and expenditure side as well. This has led to a projection of a decline in growth by 50% this year, which we fundamentally revised our growth projection from last year. And under worst case scenario, we are anticipating actual economic contraction of up to 2.5% in the continent this particular year. Next slide. Next slide, please. It has already been discussed that the job impact William mentioned is ILO continentally projects 19 million jobs will be lost. But what is quite important in the African context is 72% of all jobs are in the informal sector. So small scale operators and businesses will be heavily impacted. And of course, as you can imagine, that's where most of our jobs are created, in the informal sector. So the consequences can be quite serious. There are also public finance impacts because more expenditure is required for social protection. In fact, some projections are saying we need another $44 billion in the continent just to deal with the health impact of this COVID-19. Next slide, please. There could also be other ripple effects. Of course, we cannot provide you the full scale of the impact in such a short presentation. But some other sectors that are quite important for the continent have been also affected, such as the tourism sector, which accounts to close to 9% of GDP in the continent. We see every year about 1.4 billion visitors coming to Africa. The challenge has been that 95% of those visitors actually come from outside of Africa. So travel restrictions and other measures put in place have dramatically affected contribution of that sector to GDP in the continent today. In terms of logistics, of course, 90% of trade is by sea. And there has been a closure of some port terminals, some restrictions in terms of the number of trucks allowed cross-border, and so on and so forth. So we anticipate a 20% decline this year in terms of container activity, which would severely restrict trade. And of course, Africa already has high trading costs. These measures, as you can imagine, might escalate some of the trading costs associated for African exports. And one last aspect is that of remittance. We have, of course, a huge diaspora community for Africa living all over the world. They contribute about $65 billion every year in terms of financial transfers to the continent. Some economies depend 8 to 20% of their GDP coming from remittances. So we anticipate some decline to occur because of the global economic disruptions, not only in Africa, but in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere. So the United Nations is recommending a series of measures that we need today to come back from this crisis. One is health first. We need to stabilize the effect on public health and invest in health services and systems. Of course, energy is a critical component of this because we know that only 24% of healthcare facilities today in Africa have access to electricity. So health first and energy first are highly related agendas. Two, we need to protect people, social protection, and basic services, including electricity. And of course, we need to protect jobs, businesses, and workers. Greater international collaboration is needed. And of course, we need greater resilience. This is the immediate framework put in place as a recommendation for countries by the United Nations system. Next. And ECA has recommended additional measures for African countries. One is we need an immediate injection of $100 billion to health and social safety and economic measures. And of course, we need another $100 billion to be mobilized to support African private sector in the energy sector, in the health sector, in other sectors as well. So as a departing thought, what we need is, of course, accelerated investment at this time. Just to link this discussion of why we need the energy sector, let me just say that there are huge opportunities in terms of employment, as Irena has already said. Africa needs to tap into those opportunities. And second, Africa has huge industrialization agenda and trade agenda through the Continental Free Trade Area. All of that require massive amount of energy to be supplied in the coming many years. Therefore, we cannot put the pedal off the energy sector. And finally, of course, no development can be sustainable that leaves more than 500 million people in the continent in the darkness without access to electricity. For these reasons, our recovery packages, I would agree with the panelists that the energy sector has to be at the center of the recovery process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes. It's a quite very deep presentation you just did right there. And Africa represents 2.6% of global infections, but yet again we are seeing more and more people being asked to stay at home, and the effects of that could mean that we're having a dip in terms of industrialization. It has slowed down just because of this, but then again, the opportunities are vast, and accelerated investment in industrialization is very key. Our next presenter is Professor Matteo Di Castelnuovo. I hope I pronounced your name right. Who is from the SDA Bocconi and Africa Lab Director. Would like to welcome him to talk about Africa's electricity system response to the crisis. Are we doing it right? What do we need to get right going forward? Professor, welcome.
Thank you very much, Joy. I'm cautious about the time, so I'll try to speed up a bit to leave some time for maybe Q&A. Yeah. First, allow me to start by thanking my partners in crime, which is my two co-authors, Virginia Levi and Paola Casati, as well as Antonio Passero, Daniela Palladini, Filippo Tesfaye, and Johannes Hailu, which you just heard. Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure to work with you. Now, we decided to look at the impact of the energy sector and specifically on the electricity sector. So I'm trying to change, maybe if you guys can help. Oh, okay, it seems to be working. So the presentation is divided into two parts. I will do briefly this first part, and then at the end of the webinar, if I have time, I will go through the second part on conclusions. Now, whenever you sort of analyze, investigate any phenomenon, you need some kind of point of reference. So we decided to actually go to the to look at what is happening outside Africa, if only because of the sort of kind of information. There's an ocean of data available right now with regards to the impact of COVID-19 with regards to the energy sector, including the electricity sector, also thanks to organizations like IEA and Irena. And so, as you saw in previous presentation, IEA, so energy demand dropped worldwide depending on the fuel. But we get already two sort of take-home messages. The first one is that renewables did very well. So renewables actually went up in terms of production from renewables. Take China, for instance, in the worst days of the lockdown, solar energy was plus 12%. While the others fuel actually, as we know, for different reasons, actually their consumption went down significantly. The second take-home message is that actually the electricity sort of has fallen by 20% around the world. That is to do with the lockdown measures, but obviously that has not been necessarily offset by the rise in electricity consumption. So if we, for instance, we take the major parts in the world, so as you can see on the left-hand side, India and China, and on the right-hand side, the US and the EU, you can see that generally this is the electricity mix, which means production of electricity. And as you know, electricity is load following, meaning that actually has to follow demand in real time. So if demand goes down, production has to go down until we have sort of large deployment of storage. And so you can see that actually most fuels actually will go down. The only one which has gone up after the lockdown is the red vertical bar you can see on the graph, is actually the green line. And the green line is being represented by renewables. So renewables managed to be more resilient in this particular circumstances. And this in a situation whereby all countries desperately needed to have the electricity system up and running. Now, if we move to two African countries, our analysis was based on the amount and quality of data which we could find. First, this is a glimpse of what you can actually see in terms of Africa, which tells you that actually the African situation, the continent is wide diverse in terms of electricity access. So you go to the almost 100% the situation you have in countries like Tunisia, but to the very low rate of Democratic Republic of Congo, which is less than 10%, and the other countries somewhere in between. Then if you focus on the donuts you can see in this graph, you see then also the mix in terms of demand segmentation, how and where electricity is used with the industry, residential, commercial, agriculture, and transport is quite diverse. So you have a country like Mozambique, which is mostly industrial, and then you move to a country like Nigeria, where actually the bulk of the demand comes from residential. And this is actually meaningful for what we need to say in a few seconds. And as I mentioned, we talk about Tunisia as representative of North Africa. In this particular case, actually, we know that naturally we have to look at the gas demand, because this country's electricity production is mostly based on gas. So through the use of gas consumption, we could see that actually there was a sharp drop in the use of electricity throughout the country. This is represented by the drop in gas consumption, particularly related to power production. And so we know that in general, in the worst days, so electricity dropped by almost a third throughout the country. If we move rapidly to if we move to another part, Western and Eastern Africa, here you can see something different, which is on the top hand side, you see the graph of Kenya. So in Kenya, you could see there was both a drop in peak demand, but also in power demand, but also in energy demand. Okay, so in the worst day, we could clearly see that there was a reduction in the consumption. Now, if we move instead to Nigeria, remember what I said about Nigeria having a larger percentage of residential. And as we know, as you introduce lockdown, everybody stays at home, and so electricity consumption, residential area goes up. And this is well represented by the graph you see on the bottom side, which shows something which you will never see in other countries outside Europe, which is actually electricity consumption going up. And the reason being that actually this higher percentage of residential consumption as part of general consumption. This is for represented Western and Southern. If we move to Central and Southern Africa, so we got the data from Mozambique, Zambia, DR Congo, and Namibia. So again, if you look on your left-hand side, on the top-hand side, you see that actually electricity consumption by megawatt in Mozambique, so it was going up in 2018, then came down because of huge flooding in the country. So that's kind of an outlier, specific reasons. And then in 2020, because of COVID-19, electricity consumption coming down. You move to the right-hand side, and you can see that there was a drop in consumption in Congo, but much lower than in other countries. And the reason being also that this is a country with a very low access rate, which means probably that also has an effect, lower impact of COVID-19 upon electricity consumption. If we move to Namibia and to Zambia, then we see that actually in both countries we notice a reduction with respect to in consumption through February, March, and April with respect to previous years. This is something which we would expect, obviously, between 10 and 15% drop. And again, we're talking about countries with very different electricity rate, as you can see clearly in the sort of the box on your left-hand side. And finally, we look at the situation in Southern Africa, which had problems also with regard to the electricity system because of the well-known issues with Eskom and the liberalization. But again, if you look at the data, so we can see that you would expect in this time of the year, February, March, April, electricity consumption to go up. And yet in 2020, not surprised there, we noticed a reduction of 12% in the electricity demand. So that also was due to the fact of the COVID impact. This is in a country which has an incredibly high electricity access compared to other countries. And for the sake of time, Joy, I would actually stop here.
All right, so I know that you at least have a minute to respond to a question that I have. Would you actually say that Africa's energy reaction has been different from the rest of the world, especially during this pandemic?
Thanks for the question, Joy. Yeah, I would give you now some two parts, meaning it has been different in terms of the magnitude in some countries. So actually the drop has been less significant. And that can be explained by the fact that actually one particular country was more based on agriculture as opposed to renewables. At the same time, we saw countries like Nigeria where electricity consumption, based on the data we had, seemed to have gone up, which is counterintuitive what happened to the rest of the world. But the second part of my question, it would be the typical question that economists would use. It depends. And it depends on the fact that actually is the electricity access rate. So meaning that actually because the electricity access rate is so low, from one country to another, you may actually have a rather significant amount of electricity demand in your country. So you need to actually compare apple with apples, basically.
All right, so I'll let you actually reserve your energy for just about a few minutes before we can have you back to talk about the policy recommendations. I would now like to hear from an African country, which is a neighbor to Kenya, where I'm at, and that's Ethiopia. A case study of Ethiopia's story, and I'm going to invite the Ethiopian Women in Energy President, Philogot Tesfaye. Welcome. Okay, just a moment. I think your microphone is mute. It's good now. Still can't hear you. Okay. We're having a problem with your audio.
Can you hear me now?
It's better now. It's better now, yeah. So if you could just take us back to what you were saying in the beginning. We missed the first few seconds.
Okay. Yes, I just want to thank RES4Africa for having this platform and for inviting Ethiopian women in energy also to take part in this study. I want to thank the team which are behind this study, Ethiopian women who are involved in the energy sector. So our part is to present the cases, what happened in Ethiopia due to the COVID crisis. Can I have the next slide, please? Just to give a general overview about the Ethiopian electricity supply, most of the power that we get in Ethiopia is from renewable energy, or 95.6% from hydro and 4.4% from wind and thermal. This includes the new power plants that have been introduced into the grid in January and also in March. So I think we are also very good in adopting renewable energy sources. Next slide, please. So what happened in Ethiopia during COVID? In our context, we didn't have a total lockdown, even though there are some restrictions of having a public gathering and some other restrictions, but we didn't have any regulation of lockdown. So what we were trying to do is we saw some aspects of the sector. The first thing that we have a look was the total energy generated in the country. So we compared that from 2019 and 2018. So in the overall study that we have found that the overall trend of the energy supply from the generation side in the months of February, March, and April in 2020 does not show significant change compared to the trend of the same months of the previous 2 years. Next slide, please. So, and we were also have a look at the consumption trend by the sector. So in Ethiopian electric grid supply is categorized into three wholesale customers, the utility customers, heavy industries, and also we have interconnection to neighboring countries. That is where we export our energy. So we have trying to look at each sectors, what happened during COVID. So in the heavy industry sector, the heavy industry sector accounts to 5.6 of energy production of the country within this the months that we made the study. So in February, the supply has declined by 17.7%, and in March also there is a decline of 13.11%. Next slide. So the other sector that we saw, as I said, was the exported energy. So what happened during that was there was an increase, fortunately, especially in February, there was a 10.9% increase. And also in March, there was 0.74% increase in this sector. Next slide. So the other sector that we saw is the utility customers. This includes residential, commercial, and low and medium voltage industries consumption. From this sector, the number of commercial customers have decreased from 3.11% to 3.46% from February to March. And parallelly, the energy consumption was rising in March, and there was a sharp fall in February with 73.19%. And when we look at the number of residential customers, there was a decrease by 0.98 to 3.10% within those months. So parallelly, the energy consumption also shows a sharp decline of 37.52% from February to March, and there was also another decline from March to April. So in summary of the consumption trend in Ethiopia, when we look at the residential, commercial, and those medium voltage and low voltage industry consumptions in 2020, within this COVID period from February to April, there was a decline. Next slide, please. So what's our conclusion was on the overall trend of the energy supply for the 3 months under study, it doesn't show significant change. But in medium voltage, energy consumption shows an expected boost, while the consumption rate on commercial and residential customers has shown a decline. So these have their own background attributes that you can find in the study. The detailed part of this presentation is there in the study that you can find it after this webinar. So there is also a significant increase in the number of COVID cases that has started to register. And in June, there was registered cases of 2,915, which was high. And now also the trend shows that cases are increasing. So it could be estimated that most of the effects on the electric sector that are observed during April will persist if it is not worsened in the coming months.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Philogot. I do appreciate that, and it's quite interesting. If you look at the trends for Ethiopia, they say residential demand for electricity went up at the beginning, and then now it came down, and probably it should be going up now. So it's quite an interesting observation there. And also looking at the uptake of renewables in Ethiopia is quite impressive, with wind and thermal taking up just 4.4% and hydropower 95.6%. That's very impressive for Ethiopia. I'd now like to bring Professor Matteo back to talk to us about the policy recommendations from the report. What would you suggest that African countries do going forward and prioritize, and not just merely prioritize, but set at the top of the agenda going forward post COVID-19? Professor.
Thank you, Joy. And these are recommendations based on what we, both on the data we saw, but also in terms of the debate and the publication which came out in the last few months since the event of COVID. And there are more than one reason to be concerned in terms of not because of the technology per se, the clean technology, because we know, as Mr. Kamisekwa said, that these are technology can make economic sense by all means, but because actually what we see, news to this morning that pollution is up. We're back with a vengeance in most cities, okay? Started in Beijing and now it's back with a vengeance also all over Europe due to traffic and congestion. We know that some administration in the US have been rolling back the environmental policy, and some countries seems like clean technologies have been put, and sustainability in general is put back on the back burner. And so there are reasons to be concerned, and it's only fair to keep the tension high in that respect. So what we actually got, so the kind of take-home message, lesson learned so far, if I can manage to change the slide, or maybe if you, yeah, what happens worldwide? What did we learn? What we learned is actually that we need, definitely the world needs a resilient and secure energy system, okay, which is fundamental to any country, whether it's a developing country or developed country. It doesn't make a difference. It's the backbone of the economic system, of the social welfare. And we know this also in developed country, how much we relied on electricity. So none of us experienced major blackouts. To our knowledge, there's been no blackout throughout Africa for COVID reasons, basically, okay? So the system was really resilient. The second message that we learned is that the clean energy transition must be considered primary action for every government, okay? Because if you want to make sure you're gonna have a sustainable, stable and clean recovery package along the way in the future. The third thing is that actually renewables actually came out as the kind of the big winners in this situation, thanks to the decreasing cost, dispatching priority, of course, and greater resilience, as shown in the pandemic, during the pandemic. So these renewables actually did rather well. They're helping with the transition on a global scale and enable basically society to embrace and make further progress with regards to the many of the 17 sustainable development goals. Now, and renewables in particular proved to be central in this transition, as has been shown extensively from Mr. Kamisekwa Daipra, from the gentleman from IEA, and also from the lady from Irena. So renewables actually play a crucial role in this respect. Please, maybe next slide, please, if you can help me, because my control doesn't seem to work. So they play, definitely, we know, we have the evidence, we saw the graphs about creating green jobs, so they play a crucial role in terms of supporting the continental economic development and contribute to the SDG I mentioned earlier. But in terms of Africa, there's a sort of, as is an added bonus, and a very big one, which is one is also in terms of health. So renewables can actually be the right solution with regards to providing power supply to health centers which are scattered around the continent, often in rural areas without grid connection. And we know how important health is in general health services. Imagine how important this is in the case of a pandemic. The second thing is that actually with agriculture, renewables can actually be the suitable solution in terms of cost, in terms of technology, smaller scale, deployed at a decentralized level. They can be the right solution to help agriculture to flourish. And we also know from the evidence that when you electrify agriculture, when you provide through renewables, actually there is a bigger advantage in terms of women allowing not to be engaged in labor and being allowed to basically go through education or to do a higher sort of added value kind of jobs. The third reason is also education. Renewables, electricity access in general is obviously fundamental in terms of providing electricity access for education, and because it allows increasing the number of study hours for pupils outside the schools. It allows also in these circumstances, as we all experience with our families, it allows also to go through distance learning. And on top of that, there is also evidence showing from United Nations study that it can attract also better qualified teachers. Now, so what are the recommendations? The recommendations that actually we think that recovery packages, the synergy, so to say, between climate and economic goals are likely to have better prospects for building back better, basically, the triple B, Mr. Depras say think better. Actually, he's right, but after thinking, you have to do stuff, which means build back better, as was mentioned also by Johannes. So the government packages, the bazooka, so to say, they should aim for accelerating decarbonization and a sustainable economic transition, which clearly has to include green technologies. Also, investment should support mini-grids and off-grids. Think about the situation in different parts of the African continent, which is clearly could power and help reduce the tremendous, so the terrific number, which is 600 million people still without access in sub-Saharan Africa. Also, this package should include the SDG 7, which is clean energy access, to address the COVID-19 crisis, but also promote and foster further the sort of economic development. And governments need also to foster private investment in low carbon technology through public and private partnership, but also through private investment, as was also mentioned by Mr. Kamisekra with a very much welcome initiative like Renew Africa. Government should also, with regards to Africa, foster investment in education and training, and we explain why renewables can play a role in that respect. Stimulus packages should be addressed towards, in the case of Africa, there's an issue, of course, with rural support schemes, because they will support, as we mentioned earlier, agriculture, ecosystem generation, but also accelerating towards a cleaner energy solutions. And finally, something which tend to be underestimated, COVID-19 may be a one of a chance and one in a lifetime opportunity for the utility sector in Africa to adopt new innovative business models and flexibility through digitalization, because we've seen this case, and I think also now can be seen also as an example, plenty of examples throughout the world whereby utilities were able to reinvent themselves because of the advance of new technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Matteo. Great recommendations there. Resilient, secure energy systems are what we need going forward. I guess these are the lessons that we are learning. Clean energy transitions as well need to be considered, and renewable energy is more affordable. I guess we can all agree on that. But going forward, I think what has been emphasized by nearly all of the speakers is that public-private partnerships are something we cannot avoid going forward as well. A lot of private investment is needed, and therefore the private sector is going to play a key role going forward in renewable energy investment. I'd like to invite the Secretary General, RES4Africa Foundation, to give his conclusions or closing remarks before we can bring this to a close.
Thank you so much, Joy. There are no conclusions. I was supposed to wrap up, but I think the amount and the quality of the information you have received talks by themselves. First of all, I want to inform you that the session today is being recorded and will be available on the website, both the recording and, of course, the famous book, which we published with UNECA, which you can download for your use, and invite you to go away. I will appreciate any feedback from any of you, particularly critical one, so we can improve next generation of webinar. So far, I'm impressed by the number of people, which reach about 300 people most of the time, and the quality of the speaker, of course. I'm very proud to say that we really appreciate your interest. And of course, I appreciate Joy as my anchor woman. It really takes us to excellent professional level. Thank you, Joy. I hope you had fun also working with us today. And finally, I remind you that July 8th, there'll be a second webinar on why did only 2% renewable addition in the last decade in Africa, and what was the limitation, what could have happened, and we will print for you also another book, which will be like connecting the dots. We are still in the draft, so you will get a copy of this publication so far. So thank you so much. We have 10 minutes late, and I hate that, but it was a great pleasure. See you then. I hope you go on our website and look at our registration, or also the proceeding with the slides and also the book. And see you on the 8th of July, as many as possible. And grazie to everybody. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Ciao, Joy.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. And please remember that we'll have the next webinar on the 8th of July 2020, which will be talking about why did only 2% of renewable energy addition in the last decade occur in Africa. go to the website res4africa.org or .org and download the report that has been looked into today, the impact of COVID-19 on Africa's energy sector and the role of renewable energy to empower a long-term and sustainable recovery. I will see you again on the 8th of July 2020. For now, it's bye. Take care of yourselves and invest in renewable energy.
Yes, thank you so much. Bye.